In this section, I want to talk a little bit about how the host immune system begins to protect us from infection. And in the next couple of chapters, we'll talk in more detail about specific parts of the immune system. In general, our immune system consists of two phases, two branches that serve to protect us from both tissue damage and infection. The first is our innate immune response. Our innate immune response is our physical barriers, some chemical compounds, and generalized cell types. And what we mean by this is that our innate immune system kind of reacts the same way no matter what the pathogen is. So it doesn't matter if it's staph or strep or bacillus or E. coli. That generalized immune response is going to be the general immune response. The second branch of the immune system is sometimes called the adaptive or the antigen-specific immune response. With this branch of the immune system, this is going to be very specific for each individual infection. So you'll have a specific response to staph, to the flu, to COVID-19. And while this is great because it is so specific, the challenge with our adaptive or our antigen-specific immune response is that it can take days to build that first response, the first time you see an infection. This part of the immune response consists of things like B cells and T cells and the molecules they produce, primarily antibodies. There are a number of different molecules that the immune system produces that are soluble, meaning they're spinning around in our blood. Broadly, we have cytokines. These are various proteins that modulate the immune system. Sometimes people call cytokines pro-inflammatory, meaning they drive the response that includes things like vasodilation, fever, those kind of general responses we think of, while others are called anti-inflammatory, meaning they tamp down the immune response. I have a professor when I was a PhD student, and he was like, there's no such thing as anti-inflammatory cytokines. They're just cytokines that don't drive the immune response. I'm like, okay, whatever. If you call them pro and anti-inflammatory in this class, I'm totally okay with that. There are a couple of subsets of cytokines. So the first listed under here are interferons. These are a branch of cytokines that are designed to protect against viral infection. And again, this is just general viral response, not a specific flu versus COVID. It's just like whatever virus gets in, interferons are generally the cytokines that are going to be produced in response to that. Another group of cytokines are the chemokines. And so these are cytokines that attract specifically cells of the immune system to an area of infection. So let's say you've got a paper cut, you got some staph in there. Chemokines are that chemical signal that says, oh, here be danger. And the other cells of the immune system can respond to that particular area. This is a diagram showing how we can go from a single hematopoietic stem cell up here at the very top to the various cells of the immune system. So you get the pluripotent stem cell, which goes into the myeloid lineage and the lymphoid lineage. So the lymphoid lineage, for the most part, is where we have our adaptive or antigen-specific immune response with our B and T cells. Natural killer cells actually kind of fall under innate, but they are lymphoid cells. The myeloid progenitor is what's going to generate the majority of our innate immune response. It also generates our red blood cells and our platelets, but you see various white blood cells, including basophils, eosinophils, neutrophils, and then monocytes, which can derive into macrophages or dendritic cells. So we have a number of different cells of the immune system, but they all kind of come from the same place. It gives the general leukocyte count or white blood cell count, and then the specific types of cells and what numbers you would expect to see. Oftentimes, when trying to determine whether or not a patient has an infection, if there is an infection, you'll see a spike in some of these numbers. So the numbers will go up higher because these cells are being produced at higher levels in response to that infection. Significant decreases in the numbers of cells that you should have more of. So eosinophils and basophils are generally found at relatively low levels, but if you see a total drop in white blood cell, that can sometimes indicate a problem with the immune system. So knowing these standard numbers is really helpful because when you see numbers outside of that range, that could indicate that the patient has a problem. When we talk about the immune system, we can also talk about the organs of the immune system. We have primary and secondary organs and tissues. The primary organs are the bone marrow and the thymus. The bone marrow is in general where most of the progenitor stem cells are going to be found. The thymus is the site of T cell maturation, so that's pretty important. Some of our secondary lymphoid organs and tissues include things like your lymph nodes, tonsils, and adenoids. Your bone marrow can also be a secondary tissue because you have some more development that occurs there. The spleen is really important as a filtration and site of antigen presentation. And then in the gut, you have things like Peyer's patches. You have bronchus-associated lymphoid tissue in your respiratory system. So you have a lot of areas of your body that consist of cells and tissues of the immune system. So this table is from the older edition of the text, but a modified version of the table is found in the newer version of the text. It's just stretched out and harder to fit on one slide. So that's why I used the older version for this particular slide. But again, you can see some of the organs that I mentioned. Remember, the thymus and the bone marrow were considered to be primary, whereas lymph nodes, spleen, etc. are going to be secondary. In the lymph nodes, generally what will have happen is that's where you'll have some antigen presentation occurring. So when you have an infection, you'll have lots of white blood cells that will go to the nearest lymph nodes. And so you can have cases where patients will have swollen lymph nodes. One example I'm thinking of is Epstein-Barr virus, which causes the disease in the US that we call mono. And one of the primary symptoms of mono are swollen lymph nodes, especially in the throat. So when you have that proliferation of white blood cells in that area, that's when the lymph nodes can swell. They collect the lymphatic tissue that drains from other areas of the body. And like I mentioned, this is a major location of antigen presentation. Our spleens are very important for filtering bloodborne pathogens and other antigens. And so something to think about is in patients who've had a splenectomy, who've had their spleen removed, what consequences might that have for their immune system? So in your reflection, maybe think about that. People lose their spleens to disease, but often also to injury. Some blunt force trauma to the abdomen can cause significant damage to the spleen, necessitating its removal. So the spleen is responsible for filtering bloodborne pathogens and other antigens. It does have a zone, the periarterial lymphoid sheath, PALS, is where you'll have a lot of T cells. T cells. And then here is the germinal center where you'll have a greater collection of B cells. And then you have these mucosal associated lymphoid tissues that line all of your mucosal surfaces. In the gut, we specifically call it the GALT, the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. And so what's being shown here is a cross-section cartoon of the GALT in the gut. So you have your commensal bacteria, you have lymphocytes hanging out in the epithelial layer. You have these pyre patches, which are a more heavily dense immune type of tissue. You have M cells, which will sample the environment. And you have like the secretion of IgA. Remember, IgA, as we talk more about antibodies, we'll talk more about IgA, but it is our major secretory antibody that protects our mucosal surfaces. So you'll have other cells of the immune system hanging out here. You'll have these antimicrobial peptides, which we'll talk about in just a minute in our innate immune system section. So overall, the immune system is very complicated. That's why we offer an entire course in immunology. So hopefully you've taken that or plan to take it or are taking it at the same time. It's a really, really good course. And we're just briefly scratching the surface of how complex the immune system is. But in terms of response to infection, of course, our immune system is absolutely critical.